In 1,000th of a second, a Sassanid arrow made from horn and sinew ripped through the thick laminated wood of the legendary scutum. The screams of legionnaires rang out through the choking dust as the steel wall that had shielded the empire for centuries finally splintered. On the parched ground of Samarra, the last emperor of Constantine's bloodline fell from his horse, an omen that an era was about to fade. In 363 AD, the Romans believed their shields were invulnerable. In reality, they were completely wrong. This confrontation was not merely a battle. It was the collapse of a military philosophy before the power of Eastern long-range technology. It was a collision between the two greatest superpowers of the ancient world, late Rome on one side and the Sassanid Persian Empire on the other. Their objective was nothing less than control of fertile Mesopotamia and the economic lifeline of the age itself. The Silk Road. This was a game where the price was not just borderlands, but the survival of emperors and crowns. Behind the political calculations stood a brutal truth. Rome's honor was placed on the scales alongside control of the East. In this fight to the death, every wrong decision would be paid for with the blood of tens of thousands of elite troops under a scorching sun. Viewers will soon witness storms of arrows from composite bows, dense enough to blot out the sun and dim the sky over Samarra. They will see armored cataphractoi cavalry, compared to ancient tanks, advancing with heavy inevitability to crush any formation in their path. A true slaughter begins as armor-piercing arrows are said to punch through even the heaviest protection the Romans ever forged. Rome's arrogance is about to collide with a hard reality. Warfare is shifting into a new and unfamiliar form, and all of it will open one of the most painful chapters in history, the Great Roman Retreat deep inside enemy land. But to understand how an army that seemed unbeatable fell into such disaster, we have to rewind to the moment ambition first ignited. It begins with the reckless craving of Julian, who wanted to become a second Alexander the Great in a resplendent Roman world. He ignored every warning and stepped into a campaign with no way back into a Persian trap laid long before the first march began. That was the start of one of the most catastrophic military expeditions in history, an ending that was sealed from the very first footsteps. Look at the map of Mesopotamia that year, where geopolitical calculation pushed tens of thousands of human lives toward a dead-end gate of death. Emperor Julian entered the war with a burning ambition to restore the towering glory of the age of Trajan and Alexander the Great. He wanted more than a military victory. He longed to prove the superiority of Roman culture over the Persians, whom he dismissed as barbarians. Against his impatience, King Shapur II remained calm, executing a ruthless scorched earth strategy across Mesopotamia. Wheat fields were burned to ash, wells were filled in, and the Roman army slid into severe shortages under the skin-searing heat. The legions were drawn deeper and deeper into a desert basin where terrain and climate became a second enemy, nearly as deadly as blade and spear. On the banks of the Euphrates, a mad decision was made. Julian ordered the destruction of his entire logistical fleet, more than 1,000 ships. The flames rising from those burning vessels on the river marked the same moment the only path of retreat for 65,000 Roman soldiers was cut away. It wasn't just a declaration of fight to the death. It was the largest strategic blunder, hanging the entire army over an abyss by a single thread. Overconfidence turned a campaign of conquest into a march toward suicide, where every step forward was another step closer to annihilation. Meanwhile, across the line, the Persians silently prepared a perfect trap, patient, methodical, and built on the technology of the bow. The balance of forces began to reveal its imbalance. Rome still had 65,000 heavy infantry, but they were steadily being drained by hunger and thirst. Legionnaires in heavy iron armor now had to endure temperatures above 40 degrees Celsius in a storm of sand and dust. Iron discipline and the improved scutum, once the pride of Rome, became a crushing burden on the shoulders of men already sagging from thirst. Their enemy was the elite Sassanid cavalry warriors, born in the saddle, raised with bow and horse from childhood. The Persian secret weapon was the composite bow, a technological marvel of its age, its range, and striking power far beyond any simple wooden bow. The Sassanids did not need to close for hand-to-hand battle. They chose to protect Ctesiphon with mobility and arrow storms launched from a safe distance. Their motive was clear: defend the Zoroastrian sacred heartland and the survival of an Eastern empire against invasion from the Western world. This war was no longer just an army against an army, it was a collision between an aging war machine and a rising technological force. The pride of Roman infantry was about to meet a brutal truth. Their enemy would never stand still to be stabbed by spear or short sword. Any hope of a swift triumph at Ctesiphon evaporated as the Romans were forced into a bitter withdrawal. Inside ragged ranks, hunger and thirst began to chew through the will to fight of formations that once shook the ancient world. And that was the moment Shapur II understood the timing was perfect to strike a decisive blow at the bleeding pride of Rome. The finest Sassanid cavalry received the order to ride, beginning a blood-soaked pursuit across the scorching sands of Samarra. The rasp of bowstrings and the pounding of hooves signaled that one of history's worst military tragedies was about to crash down upon the Roman soldiers. This great flight would become the proving ground where Eastern archery technology demonstrated its overwhelming power against the West's most famous wall of shields. All the preparation in tactics and weapons on both sides would now be weighed in a clash, with no room for mercy. Persian preparation and Roman vulnerability had set the stage for a military demonstration that would reshape the history of war. In desperation, Emperor Julian had only one refuge left: the testudo, the legendary tortoise formation shields, locked tight, like the scales of a giant beast. It was designed to turn the legion into a moving fortress, shielding the infantry from arrow rain falling out of the sky. Julian hoped Roman discipline would let them fall back safely toward the northern frontier while keeping their fighting line intact. But King Shapur II had no intention of meeting head-on a wounded beast that still carried sharp claws heavy infantry. The Persian king unleashed a ruthless hit-and-run rhythm. Horse archers harassed from a distance, then vanished into curtains of sand and dust whenever the Romans tried to counterattack. The Sassanid objective was simple and brutal: to grind away the last reserves of strength and break the enemy's spirit under an invisible pressure that never stopped. They waited for the moment the Roman shield wall showed gaps born of fatigue or impatience, then planned to finish with iron-armored heavy cavalry. This was a contest of minds: the rigid silence of wooden walls versus the lethal flexibility of Eastern warriors on horseback. Each arrow was not only meant to wound, it was a psychological strike against the belief in the invincibility of Rome's famed battle order. Persian preparation for this confrontation had begun years earlier, deep inside the most secret weapon workshops of the Sassanid Empire. Master craftsmen meticulously combined antelope horn, ox sinew, and mulberry wood to build composite bows with extreme elasticity. Drying and layering those materials bonded with specially prepared animal glue allowed the bow to store tremendous energy when drawn to full length. Meanwhile, in the Roman camp, smiths struggled to reinforce the shields by adding heavy iron edging to their weakest seams. That reinforcement accidentally turned the scutum already heavy into a near 10-kilogram weight, draining a soldier's strength with every step. The extra mass made raising the shield overhead to catch high, arcing rainbow shots feel like punishment torture for arms already trembling. A miscalculation of weight versus protective gain turned Rome's survival tool into a trap that imprisoned its own men. When night fell, the desert's calm was torn apart by sudden Persian raids, forcing the Romans into relentless sleep deprivation. The pounding of hooves and the dry snap of bowstrings in the dark kept Julian's soldiers locked in a state of maximum tension. Every attempt at rest was shattered, turning the retreat into a long, unending nightmare where the line between life and death grew thinner than ever. History's hourglass was running out, draining its final grains toward the fateful day. June 26, 363 on the ground of Samarra. The greatest battle was about to erupt, where both sides' preparations would be tested in fire, an inferno of blood that would reshape the balance of the world. Now, every commander's eyes fixed on the first movements across the field, just as the Persian signal horns began to echo through the open air. At Maranga, the Sassanid forces began to deploy in a broad crescent, encircling the Roman legions as they tightened into a defensive knot. The formation let the Persians concentrate fire from multiple directions, so the Roman infantry's shield line was struck not only from the front, but also along both flanks. Sassanid horse archers galloped in close, loosed probing shots, then suddenly wheeled and fled as if in retreat. In that instant, Roman soldiers witnessed the classic Parthian-shot Persian riders, firing back with frightening accuracy while their horses were still running away at full speed. Arrow after arrow was launched with a speed and impact so violent that even the most battle-hardened men felt a jolt of fear. The secret lay in the physics of the composite bow. Its distinctive recurve design stored far more elastic energy than a simple wooden bow. When the string was drawn, the outer sinew layers stretched, while the inner horn layers compressed, creating maximum driving force at the moment of release. The result was a higher initial arrow velocity, letting the shaft retain enough kinetic energy to punch through protective materials even at distance. While ordinary Roman wooden bows bled power quickly, Sassanid arrows still flew on a taut, forceful trajectory. On the field, thousands of arrows poured down like unending rain, burying themselves into the scuda of Roman infantry. Each arrow that stuck carried not only death, but the dead weight of its wooden shaft, making every shield feel strangely heavier with every impact. Within minutes, shields meant for protection began to resemble giant porcupines, dozens of shafts packed thick across their faces. The burden of reinforced wood, near 10 kilograms plus dozens of embedded arrows, pushed beyond what starving, dehydrated arms could endure. Roman soldiers no longer had the strength to hold shields high enough to cover the head, leaving them exposed to arcing rainbow shots falling in from behind. Gaps began to open inside the tortoise formation, as men were forced to lower shields to breathe and recover, or because they had been wounded by penetrating hits. The dry crack of splintering wood and the harsh clatter of metal rang out, signaling fractures in a defensive system once held up as the model of the ancient world. Fully armored Sassanid heavy cavalry, encased from head to toe, watched from a distance as the enemy sagged, waiting for the golden moment to deliver the final shove. The combination of long-range pressure and infantry exhaustion carved a fatal weakness into the tactical structure Julian had trusted. With every minute, the pride of the Roman legions was ground down a little more beneath the sun's heat and the cruelty of Eastern archery. Maranga was not only a long-range duel, it was the overture to a larger tragedy. As Rome's command center began to waver, Julian realized that without a breakthrough, his lines would be shredded before they ever saw the shadow of the northern frontier. Tension climbed to its limit as the night of June 25 fell, covering faces tightened by dread and despair. History was preparing one of its bloodiest chapters, where an emperor's life would become the final price of an empire's arrogance. Persian brass horns sounded again in the darkness, warning that this brief silence was only the pause before a greater storm. The fighting was about to shift into its most brutal phase, as both sides pushed everything into a single, fateful throw at Samarra the next morning. Julian would face a decision that could either salvage something or bury Rome's glory completely in the sands of fertile Mesopotamia. But amid the chaos of the decisive clash, an unbelievable opening would appear, pushing the emperor into the arms of death. That was when the real drama began, when the safety of the empire's head was threatened by his own haste and lack of preparation. Dark shapes of Sassanid cavalry began to close in, and a fateful spear was being readied to pierce the heart of a conquering dream. The light of the new day would bring not only desert heat, but the collapse of a legend long believed unbreakable on the battlefield. Prepare to step into the final moments of Samarra, where an emperor's blood would stain the yellow sand and change history forever. Everything was ready for a ruthless finishing blow. The Persians had arranged through months of calculated retreat and relentless pursuit. The power of the composite bow and the crushing heaviness of the Roman shield had written a perfect script for the fall of a Western military monument. The ancient world would hold its breath, watching the moment Julian threw himself into battle, unaware that death was waiting ahead. Samarra's sandstorm was about to swallow everything, leaving behind hard lessons in technology and tactics for future generations to study and weigh. Tonight was the last night of calm before the screams of Samarra truly began and ended a brilliant but short-lived dynasty. On the night of June 26, the darkness over Samarra was ripped apart by signal horns and the pounding of Sassanid hooves. A brutal assault crashed straight into the flank of the exhausted Roman column, throwing the ranks into chaos amid sky-splitting screams. Hearing the uproar, Emperor Julian sprang up from his tent with the courage of a warrior, yet also with a fatal, rushing impatience. Because of the merciless heat of Mesopotamia, the emperor had removed his breastplate earlier, and he ran into the fight without time to put it back on. He drove straight toward the clash of steel with only his sword and a small shield in hand, trying to restore order to soldiers already breaking in panic. In the choking dust and flickering firelight, a spear or a penetrating arrow from a Persian rider found a lethal opening in the middle of his chest. The Sassanid weapon drove deep into Julian's liver, and the emperor collapsed on horseback as his guards looked on in shock. The wound was so severe that blood soaked the purple cloak, the symbol of Rome's supreme power, fading into the desert sand and grit. News that the emperor had been gravely wounded spread like poisoned wind, collapsing the last reserves of will inside the Roman legions. The shield wall that had held for centuries now disintegrated as soldiers fled in terror before the thunderous pressure of Sassanid cavalry. The Persian horsemen did not miss the moment. They swept through shattered ranks and turned a retreat into one of history's bloodiest massacres. In Samarra's Black Night, the hope of a reborn Roman Empire guttered out with the weak breath of the last emperor of Constantine's bloodline. Julian's death was not only the loss of a leader, it was the end of Rome's ambition to conquer the East. Every groan Julian released through fever and delirium felt like a knife driven into the heart of legions already exhausted in body and broken in spirit. Rome's finest physicians stood helpless as the Eastern spear completed its grim work in the flesh of an emperor. Across the lines, Shapur II received the report with cold calm from his daring scouts, his decade-long plan finally bearing fruit. The disorder spread so far that even senior officers could no longer maintain the most basic combat commands inside the army. The Romans, once proud of logistics and discipline, now watched Scuda thrown aside as men clawed for survival in the dark. Sassanid arrows kept pouring down without pause, a relentless reminder that death followed every step of flight. Firelight from burning camps reflected the collapse of a conquering dream Julian had built with his entire life. At Samarra, history recorded one of its most tragic moments, the head of the strongest empire in the world falling in the most miserable way. Loyal guards struggled to shield Julian's body inside the enemy's grasp, but the power of Sassanid cavalry was overwhelming now. The flank strike proved a brutal truth. Rome's heavy shield and armor were useless when punished at the weak point of mobility. The survivors could only look north, toward a distant frontier blurred by smoke, flame, and merciless pursuit. The night of June 26 became a scar that would never heal in Rome's chronicles, marking the end of a brilliant golden age. Julian drew his final breath while the sounds of blades and spears still echoed in the air, signaling a defeat as bitter as it was humiliating. As the first light of dawn rose, the ancient world would reel at the realization that Rome's crown had been buried under Persian sand. And after that moment of horror, a shameful reality awaited the survivors, forced to face a dark future and the terms of surrender. Emperor Julian was left forever in the burning sands of Samarra, only 31 years old, in what should have been the prime of a commander's life.